From Abraham to Jesus, a very brief history of Israel, Judah, and Judea, part 2. We ended last time with the death of Solomon, and his kingdom gets split up. You get the north, the kingdom of Israel, and the south, the kingdom of Judah. Just to be clear, the south, the kingdom of Judah, is the Jews. So when people talk about the Jews, it's this group. And what happens to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, is that it disappears out of history fairly quickly. The two kingdoms coexist for quite a while, and sometimes they're rivals, sometimes they're fighting. We shan't go into all of that. Too much big picture stuff to go through, I'm afraid. But there's quite a lot of that in the books of Kings. But the kingdom of Israel disappears from history when the Assyrians show up, and the Assyrians are a very militaristic people. They're from roughly modern day Syria, and they build a big empire, and this is the empire. You can see in the dark green area it starts off there and it expands into the light green area. If you notice the dates, 824 BC and 671 BC, for those of you who don't spend a lot of time thinking about ancient history, remember BC, before Christ, so the lower the number, the closer it is to our time. Probably self-explanatory, but in case some of you don't spend all your time thinking about this stuff, it might be a good reminder. So by 671 BC, you can see they've conquered a really large area. Egypt, Mesopotamia, that region I talked about yesterday where Babylon, Borsippa, Kish is, all those places. They've got they're a really big empire for the time. Just to bring your attention to two areas. On the right, you can see their heartland really, and the capital of the Assyrian Empire was Nineveh. And have an interesting thing, if you know the story of the prophet Jonah, the one who gets swallowed by the whale, God wants him to go to Nineveh, and of course what does Jonah do? He gets on a boat and sails across the Mediterranean. He wants to get away from Nineveh and the Assyrians. He wants God to punish them. The Jews never forgot what the Assyrians did. I think they had they were a bit bitter about it, not understandably so. You can see on the map, Judah survives and Jerusalem survives when the northern kingdom doesn't. And this is when the whole thing with the Samaritans starts, because the way that one of the ways that the Assyrians control their empire is that they deport people en masse. So when they conquer Israel, the northern kingdom, and archaeologists have found lots of records from the Assyrians, and the ones relating, the Assyrians' own records relating to the destruction of Israel tell us they deported 27,290 people. And they took them back to their sort of heartland, which is something in the region of 800 miles journey, I would guess. So they took them off a long way, and they took people from other conquered areas and they brought them and settled them in the former Israel, the former northern kingdom, of which Samaria had been the capital. And these incomers, these sort of exiles from other part of the Assyrian Empire, they worshipped other gods. They were pagans, but they started worshipping Yahweh, the Israelite God, as one God among many. So for the Jew, and it's worth mentioning, we think there were probably also a few Israelites who survived the Assyrian deportation. So what had been the northern kingdom of Israel became this mixed kingdom of a few survivors of the old northern kingdom, and then lots of refugees who had been forcibly brought along by the Assyrians and were pagans. And from this time onwards, it's never really a Jewish area. It's a separate area, but it was once part of their land and their, back in the time of David. So there's always, from now on, there's always something of this bitterness towards the Samaritans, which you see in the New Testament. But like all empires, the Assyrian Empire doesn't last forever. And Babylon, which you've seen a couple of times as on the map as a city, that in turn becomes an empire and overthrows the Assyrians. And what you see here gives you a little idea of what Babylon might have been like. German archaeologists in the 19th century took a lot of stuff from the ruins of Babylon and reconstructed the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar was one of their goddesses. You can see they were, this was a sophisticated city, architecture, art. The Babylonians were a really ancient city. They've been around for probably about 1,500 years at this point. No, 2,000 years maybe. So here you can see the empire they created. I couldn't find a map with English, but I think it's okay. You can see Babylonia is obviously Babylon, both the city and the empire. And they get all the way around. They finally conquer Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Judah had survived the Assyrians. It doesn't survive the Babylonians. The Babylonians, there's a couple of, there's a first sort of invasion and a second invasion. First invasion, they deport all the aristocracy, and the last of the Davidic kings, King Jehoiachin, who was only 18 years old. And they take him off into exile in Babylon along with all the aristocracy. And then 10 years later, they come back and they take away sort of the middle classes, the artisans, and they just leave a few sort of farmers behind. And this more, because this has affected the Jews, and the Jews are the ones whose story we really have in a lot of the Bible, this really sort of stayed with them. And this is the time of the prophet Jeremiah. And Jeremiah sort of, he warns the people, you've displeased God, you haven't followed his law, and now Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is the one who God is using to punish you. And your sacrifices are in vain, and the great temple that Solomon builds and the whole of Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians. And so you've got this picture of Jeremiah sitting in the ruins. So the Jews must have thought, what about all these promises which God made to us? Okay, we've been unfaithful, but God promised, God made a promise that David would be the kings of David and his descendants, his throne would last forever. What about all that? They'd been a pretty rotten lot. They'd been worshipping other gods left, right, and centre alongside the one true God. But they were probably still wondering about God's faithfulness at this time. So the Jews get deported to Babylon. I mentioned King Jehoiachin, the last king of David, a last Davidic king. Interestingly, we know from both the Bible and from Babylonian records, which archaeologists have found, that he stays as a prisoner for, I think I want to say 36 years. And then the Babylonian kings raise him up, and they treat him with honor as a captive king. And the Babylonian records actually tell us the amount of food they gave him. They didn't use money so much in the way of coins. It was more how much sort of food you were given, which denoted status. So that during the exile, there must have been a few signs of hope. But there was a lot of bitterness and sadness. And one place where you really see this is Psalm 136, 137. Later on, I'll explain why we've got two sets of numbering for the Psalms. But this is a famous psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Zion, by the way, is sort of the hill or the ridge which Jerusalem is built on. It's often kind of a bit of a synonym for Jerusalem. So it starts off with them there, and there's it's captured in this picture. And the Babylonians want them to entertain them. It's sort of, if you imagine sort of an English person, well, I quite like that song, The Fields of Athenry, sing that one for us. You get, if you have anyone there with Irish origins, you get the idea of what the Jews were feeling. And then it goes on, how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Because remember, their land had been given them by God. It was a promised land, which Moses had led and Joshua had led them to. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. If I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. So there's this, you can see in this psalm, there's a real sense of longing to go home. And if you think of if you've ever encountered any refugees in the present day, you may have sort of seen similar sentiments. There are people in exile, and it's difficult to. A lot of the Old Testament is written down in its current form around the time of the Babylonian exile. Not all of it, but a great deal of it is. And you can see this sense of exile and being a captured people very strongly. Now we're going on to the last part, and this bit isn't actually included in the liturgy. When we use this psalm at Mass or in the Divine Office, they don't include this bit. You'll see why in a second, but I think it's worth looking at as well. It goes, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites. Remember, you might remember from last time, the Edomites are one of the other tribes nearby who are ancient enemies. The day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations. The Jews blamed the Edomites for sort of helping the Babylonians and encouraging them. But the last bit is probably the reason we don't include it. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. And if you're wondering about the last couple of lines, that's talking about dashing their children against the rock. You can see there's this real sort of anger from the psalmist, anger against the people who are holding them captive, wishing harm on their children. It's not a very comfortable thing to read, which is why I suppose we don't have it in the liturgy. But one of the great things about the Psalms is that you do have they do express quite uncomfortable emotions at times. And, the Psalms, I think it's the Catechism, which calls the Psalms a treasury of prayer. I'm pretty sure the Catechism is quoting something else on that. But we often, we have, the Psalms are great. You can pray them when you're feeling angry and bitter, which happens from time to time. Please God, not always. There's also lots of very joyful Psalms, but you keep praying to God. It's an example of you keep praying to God even when you're very angry, and that's the Jews are still staying faithful. And actually, their time in Babylon starts to give them more of a sense of an identity, and it starts to give them more of a sense of a religion too, because up until now it's been about sacrificing animals at the temple in Jerusalem, but the temple's been destroyed and they can't do that anymore. So what does it mean to worship God if you can't sacrifice the way that the law prescribes and the way that they've always done? But there are some signs of hope for the Jews in the exile. The exile lasts sort of 50 to 60 years, I think, memory serves. And there's a prophet called Ezekiel. He's got one of the major prophets in the Old Testament, and he prophesies them a new covenant. And we're going to look at just a passage here. So this is about 500 years after King David and about 500 years before Jesus, roughly speaking. So this bit from Ezekiel says, "My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall follow my ordinances and be careful to observe my statutes." Well, if you're a Jew in Babylon at this time, David's been dead for 500 years. You can't keep all the laws, certainly not the ones to do with sacrifice, because the temple's gone. So this would seem like quite a dramatic promise. But it goes on. "They shall dwell in the land where your fathers dwelt, that I gave to my servant Jacob. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever. And David my servant shall be their prince forever." So you can imagine Ezekiel's audience must have been scratching their heads going, well, I really hope that this comes true and that, God sends us back to Judah. But they must have been, been hoping for a miracle. Because again, it's going back to the promise that David's throne will survive, but that would have looked incredibly unlikely at the time Ezekiel was talking to them. And it continues still. "I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will bless them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary is in the midst of them forevermore." So the sanctuary and the dwelling place, again, they're going to be thinking about a temple, rebuilding the temple. Of course, Christians read this, and we read this all as being fulfilled by Jesus. Jesus, the son of David, makes a covenant of peace. His covenant with us is an everlasting covenant. He dwells with us forever. We are his people. If you ever wonder sort of where some of the prophecies about Jesus are found in the Old Testament, you can start to look, I think, at things like this. And sure enough, God does bring back the Jews to their homeland, or at least the ones who want to go, because some of them become quite settled in Babylon, and when they have the opportunity to leave, they actually stay there. So you start to get this diaspora of the Jewish people spread all out and living in many countries beyond their ancient homeland. So this rather dramatic picture, this shows the fall of Babylon to Cyrus of Persia. This is a painting, so it's not intended. I wouldn't say this is historically accurate as such, but it gives you some impression, an artistic impression of what Babylon, that golden sort of city, would have looked like. It would have looked very impressive. They did have these sort of big pyramid-style buildings, ziggurats they called them, and it was a huge and ancient city. And as you saw before, it had a big empire. But Cyrus, king of Persia, comes along. and he defeats the Babylonians, and Babylonian Empire falls and the Persian Empire arrives. And the Persians, as empires go, are actually very civilized. They don't do the mass deportations. In fact, they allow people to go back to the countries they were deported from. So under the Persians, you get Jewish exiles starting to go back to Judah. And actually, Cyrus of Persia and the guy who comes after him, Darius, they both help to finance the rebuilding of the temple. So the Persians are pretty good as imperial overlords go. But there's a particularly interesting thing about Cyrus. This is from Isaiah 45, 1-7. I've only given you the first 2 verses here because there's so much to get through. But it reads, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and ungird the loins of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the mountains." And it continues for another 5 verses. So Isaiah really sees Cyrus as God's anointed. God's sending Cyrus to get the Jewish people back to their homeland, and to do that, he's bringing down the Babylonian Empire, and this is God's God's action. So you see that the Jews have this understanding that God will sometimes outside forces like the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrians are, in a sense, punishment for not being faithful to God. But God also uses them. But God uses then the Persians to restore them. But I just want to pick up on this word anointed. It's very easy just to read over the word anointed and see it as another word, but it's a really interesting word. Anointed basically means Messiah. So on the start of Wednesday, I said who was called a Messiah in the Old Testament. It's Cyrus of Persia. And Messiah is anointed is a Hebrew, anointed is an English word. Messiah is a Hebrew word. Christ is the Greek word for Messiah. So when we talk about Jesus Christ as if Christ is just a surname, like Smith or Jones or whatever. But Jesus Christ is the same as saying Jesus the Anointed or Jesus the Messiah. So Cyrus is this messianic figure, and described as such by Isaiah. So you begin to see that the idea of a Messiah has this quite dramatic sort of resonance, really. So when people talk about Jesus as a Messiah, we sort of take that for granted. Well, we know Jesus is the Messiah. What more to say? But when you think of the history of Israel and that Cyrus is the one who brings them back out of exile, he's a dramatic figure. But of course, there's a big difference between Cyrus and Jesus. And the big difference is Cyrus doesn't know God, but God uses him anyway. If we were to read the rest of that section of Isaiah 45, you'd see Isaiah spells that out in those words pretty much. So it's an interesting, I think, sort of reminder there that God works in all sorts of ways. Sometimes through the most unexpected ways, but he comes through for people, but probably not in the way that we sometimes expect. So once the Jews get back, they start to, or the ones who return under Persian patronage, start to rebuild the temple. They rebuild it eventually in a grander style than Solomon, if you can imagine that. This is a model of how it probably looked. And this one survives until the Romans destroy it in AD 70, about 35 years after the death of Jesus. And of course, the Jews are able to go back to sacrificing the way that the law of Moses prescribed. So they're able to reinstate their religion and to have it all again, and the way it's supposed to be, which is perhaps especially poignant for us at the moment, as here we are in the COVID-19 times, and we've been without mass for several months now, and we're just about soon we're going to be able to start going to mass again, albeit in a slightly limited way to start with. So you can imagine how the perhaps now particularly how they might have felt about things. Oops. But of course, you can probably guess, just as the other empires before it, the Persian Empire doesn't last forever. And a man called Alexander the Great comes along, very famous figure, you might have heard of him. He only really has a career of about 10 years, but you can see on this map, he conquers everywhere from Greece to the borders of India. I mean, he's basically a military genius who, for 10 years, takes his army and just conquers everything in his path. He doesn't really live long enough to rule it, though. But there's one very important thing that comes from Alexander's conquests, and that's the spread of Greek language and culture all over this part of the world, which which you can see he conquered. And so Greek really starts to become the common language of the Middle East and beyond, and in places like Egypt as well. And we'll see that's important for us and for the Jews and later on for the Christians. But when Alexander dies, his kingdom breaks up. His generals and friends split it into different sections. You can see there's different ones. The only ones we're really interested in are Egypt, the purple one, and the Ptolemies start to rule there. And then the big yellow area is ruled by the Seleucids. And if you can see Jerusalem marked on the map, that's between, that's on the little land route between Egypt and the yellow area, the Seleucid Empire. And Judah, or what it starts to become called Judaea now, or we start to talk about it as Judaea, because the Greek and later on the Latin words are Judaea, not Judah. So this is where we start to talk about Judaea instead of Judah. It's also a sort of a new chapter in history, really, so it's kind of convenient in that way. So this Judaea is really sort of caught between these two superpowers. The Jews spend most of their history caught between different superpowers, and it's one of the reasons their history is so tragic. There's so much suffering in it. But there's a couple of interesting things. In Egypt, Ptolemy, you don't pronounce the P on the front of Ptolemy. I'm not sure why it's there, but it is. In Egypt, there's quite an enlightened ruler called Ptolemy Philadelphus, friend of brothers or something. He's quite an enlightened guy, and he's supposed to have and Egypt was a great center of learning, and he got the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek. And this gives us a version of the Old Testament which is called the Septuagint. And it's actually very, in terms of the manuscripts which exist, it's actually very old. This is what you can see as an example from the 2nd century BC. So say about 150 BC, for example. The actual Hebrew text, that's a lot later, in fact. It wasn't until around, about 800 or 900 years later that they started to the Jews started to put the Hebrew text into its current form. So the Greek Old Testament is actually quite ancient, and it was very widely used because a lot of the reason, obviously the reason it was translated beyond King Ptolemy's interest was the practical reason that a lot of Jews living in Egypt, and there was a very big community in Alexandria, they'd stopped speaking Hebrew. They couldn't understand the Hebrew scriptures. So they translated them into a language they did understand. And it's very widespread. And the early Christians actually used the Greek New Testament far more than the Hebrew New Testament. Because Greek is a much more widely spoken language. And the other interesting thing about this is this leads to a difference between our Catholic Bibles and Protestant Bibles. Martin Luther and the Protestant reformers decided they ought to go to the Hebrew Old Testament, and they ought to use that. They figured it would be better because Hebrew was the ancient language. But so that means that the reason you have two sets of numbering on the Psalms is, and if you have a Protestant Bible and a Catholic Bible, you have many of the Psalms will have slightly different numbers. Protestant Bibles follow the Hebrew numbering, Catholic Bibles follow the Greek numbering. We also have in Catholic Bibles 7 extra books which existed in the Septuagint but didn't exist in the Hebrew Bible. Those are books of Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Sirach, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, and also the books of Daniel and Esther have some extra bits which are in the Septuagint but not in the Hebrew Bible. So down to today, I mean, you can have a look in if you've got a Catholic Bible, you'll have slightly more than if you have a Protestant Bible, although all the important parts are the same. But we do have slightly more in ours for that reason, and we have different numberings of the Psalms. So this is a period where, in some ways, things are okay for the Jews. Certainly for the diaspora Jews, they're not doing too badly, and the Jews in Judea have some good times, and then they have some very bad times. Oops. A Seleucid king comes along called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We've got a coin here with his face and his inscription. Now, Epiphanes is a Greek word, and it means God made manifest. So Antiochus obviously had quite a high opinion of himself. It's a claim to some kind of semi-divinity. You're probably thinking this is a bit like the word epiphany, where we celebrate the coming of the wise men to revere Jesus. And it's the same word in Greek. Our word epiphany comes from the same Greek word. It means God made manifest. Of course, Jesus really is God made manifest. Antiochus was a rather a ruler with a very strong ego and not that much success in many ways. But at this time, the Jews in Jerusalem were split. Some of them quite liked all this Greek culture, like the ones in Egypt. Some of the ones out in the countryside around Jerusalem were much more traditional and didn't like it at all. But you get a bit of fighting between the various factions, and this guy Antiochus IV thinks that they're rebelling against him, so he turns up with his army and massacres 40,000 Jews and installs a garrison to keep control. So another tragic chapter. But not happy with that, he decides that he's going to repurpose the temple in Jerusalem So, oops, I'm getting my slides all wrong tonight. So he sets up in the temple a shrine to Zeus, the Greek king of the gods. He brings in unclean animals to sacrifice to offend the Jews. And if you read the book of Maccabees, it sounds like there was some kind of sex ritual going on in there too. It all stuff really going to upset the Jews. And anyone who won't worship the pagan gods, he martyrs. A famous example is the story of Eleazar. This sometimes comes up. This is in the book of Maccabees, Second Maccabees. You sometimes hear it when there's when we're remembering a martyr. Eleazar is an old man. He's always been holy, and people, the collaborators say to him, "Well, look, if you won't eat pork or meat that's been sacrificed, we'll give you something which you can eat, and just pretend you're eating pork. You don't have to violate your principles. Just be seen to conform." And Eleazar says, "Well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm an old man. If I do it, then the young people are going to think that that in my old age I decided I could sort of give up God and worship these pagan gods." And so they murder Eleazar. They martyr him. And there's a lot more people, a lot more Jews are killed at this time. But they don't take it lying down. There's an uprising against the Seleucids. A group called the Maccabees, led by Judas Maccabee. They wage initially a sort of guerrilla war, and they throw them out. And then as time goes on, they start to reconquer, and the Jews actually become independent again for a time. But unfortunately, the Maccabees start as freedom fighters, but they become a dynasty, which we call the Hasmoneans. And they become these not particularly pleasant kings, and kings who are not descended from David. There's no connection to the royal line of David here. And they eventually give way to Herod the Great, who you've all heard of, I imagine. Herod's not actually ethnically Jewish. He's Idumean, which is just south of Judea. And he practices the Jewish religion in quite a selective way. Some things he does, some things he doesn't. He's incredibly pro-Roman. He manages to be friends with Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Cleopatra wasn't Roman, but also Augustus. And he really builds up his city basically as a Roman stooge. He has a lot of different wives and children, but I mean he's basically ruthless and paranoid, and he murders one of his wives, actually Mariamne, one of the ones he seems to have actually loved, and he seemed to be incredibly jealous. Ended up convinced she was plotting against him and had her executed. He also had 3 of his sons executed at different times. He was really not a very nice man. However, he was a great builder, and he restores the temple in Jerusalem. Again, I'm not entirely sure how accurate this is, but it gives you an impression of what it could have looked like. He certainly extended it. They spent decades. It was long after he was dead that they finished rebuilding it. But he certainly spends a lot of time and money working on the temple in Jerusalem, which is partly probably piety and partly a way of trying to make himself more popular, because the ordinary people are fairly devout, even though he isn't particularly. But he does. You can start to see starting to get a sense of the geography of Judea now. He does end up controlling quite a big area. Idumea, his homeland, is just down there in the south. You can see Judea, Jerusalem, Samaria. He gets the old northern kingdom. So he kind of ends up with more than David had. And Galilee, obviously where Nazareth is, where Jesus grew up. And quite a few Jews moved from Judea, the area around Jerusalem, up to Galilee. On an interesting side note, there's quite a lot of contact with the Greeks up around there. Two of the apostles, Philip and Andrew, they've both got Greek names, not Jewish names, they're Greek names. So there's quite a lot of contact with Greek culture, even in Galilee at the time of Jesus. So last thing about Herod is, of course, the thing he's famous for, the massacre of the innocents. It's not really very difficult to believe that Herod ordered it to happen. It's only mentioned in Matthew's Gospel, but it's not. It probably wouldn't have seemed noteworthy enough for Josephus or one of the other secular historians to mention. But yeah, it's quite in character with the brutality of Herod's reign. Herod dies and his kingdom gets divided up. Pretty quickly, a lot of it comes under direct Roman control. So by the time of Jesus, the area looks a bit like this. Well, it looks like this. So you've got the light green is the Roman province of Judea. The dark green is just part of the Roman province of Syria, which was huge. Two of Herod's sons are still around, Philip and Antipas. We meet them in the Gospels. They kill John the Baptist. And there's also the Decapolis, Decapolis means 10 cities, and they're autonomous. And actually, if you read if you've got a Bible and you look in the back, you've probably got a map of this area in Jesus's time. But he goes to Jesus travels around, and he goes to quite a few different places, and not all of them. So the Decapolis seems to have been largely Greek speaking. So Jesus really travels around this quite a lot, and he's going through areas which are controlled by these Jewish, or these puppet kings, these sons, Herods, and also directly under Roman control. So that brings us to the end of our rather whistle-stop tour of the history of Israel, Judah, and Judea. Thank you to Marisha and Becky for their services in co-hosting and uploading and all sorts of stuff. Next time, we're going to move on to the question, was Jesus just a nice man? And you can probably guess what I'm going to say the answer to that is, but we'll come back to that. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll go on now to questions and answers.